equanimity means basically a space where you're balanced and centered, where you're as firm as a mountain in your stability. You can't be pulled off either off center, either by craving or by aversion or by delusion. I found a definition I liked from Bhikkhu Bodhi, who is an American, Bhikkhu means monk. And so monks from Burma and Sri Lanka are called bhikkhus. Bhikkhu Bodhi was a monk in Sri Lanka for a long time. He's still a monk, but he lives in the US again now. He says equanimity is evenness of mind, unshakable freedom of mind, a state of inner equipoise that cannot be upset by gain or loss, honor and dishonor, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. Upekkha, which is the Pali word for equanimity, is freedom from all points of self-reference. It is indifference only to the demands of the ego self with its craving for pleasure and position, not to the well-being of one's fellow human beings. So, evenness of mind, unshakable freedom of mind, a state of inner equipoise that cannot be upset by any of the 8 worldly winds. Freedom from all points of self-reference. Indifference to the ego demands of the small self. It's not just balance, it's a state of great spaciousness and joy, where your mind has just expanded so wide that whatever happens is just diffused into that broad space. Equanimity is the 4th of the 4 brahmavihārās, the 7th of the factors of enlightenment, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the 10th of the 10 paramitas. So the brahmavihārās are it translates as the noble abodes or the divine abodes, the divine dwelling places. And there are 4 mind states that emerge from practice. They're both practices themselves and the result of those practices. So the first brahmavihāra is metta, or loving kindness. The second brahmavihāra is compassion, which is loving kindness in the face of suffering. The third brahmavihāra is mudita, which is empathetic joy, taking joy in the happiness of others. And the 4th is upekkha, or equanimity. And the 4 of them are interrelated. You have to have a grounding in equanimity to be able to enter deeply into compassion, for instance. Because without that grounding in equanimity, the other person's suffering can overwhelm you. So with equanimity, you're able to feel the quivering of your own heart in response to the suffering of others, without being overwhelmed by their suffering. They're able to stay very grounded and centered, even in the presence of great suffering. So, loving kindness, compassion, and empathetic joy all require a grounding in equanimity. And equanimity emerges from deep loving kindness and compassion and equanimity, empathetic joy. So there's kind of a synergy between the four brahmavihārās, and all of them are joyful states. Even compassion for immense suffering is a joyful state, where you feel both the pain of the other person or people, but also the joy of compassion. I think it was Richie Davidson who did a series of neuroscience experiments where he had Tibetan Buddhist monks, longtime monks who'd been practicing compassion for 30 or 40 or 50 years. He did EEGs on them while they were doing compassion meditation. And at first, he and the technicians thought that the equipment was broken because they were getting registers in the area of the brain where happiness is located that were off the charts of anything they'd ever seen before, like 800 times any happiness they'd ever seen before in a Westerner. So, although it doesn't seem obvious on the surface, compassion is a joyful state. And so is equanimity. The 7 factors of enlightenment, let's see if I can do them, mindfulness, investigation, rapture, calm, energy, mindfulness, investigation, energy, rapture, calm, concentration, and equanimity. And those are, they're both consecutive and simultaneous, but they build on each other, so that mindfulness leads your mind to want to investigate and look more deeply at what you're experiencing. The investigation generates energy. Viriya, energy. The energy generates rapture or joy. The joy generates calmness. The calmness generates concentration, and concentration generates equanimity. Well, equanimity is also the final state before attaining liberation or enlightenment. And the 10 paramitas are 10 virtues, the virtues of a bodhisattva. I can't do all 10 off the top of my head, but they include mindfulness, patience, equanimity. Equanimity, again, is the 10th of the 10 paramitas. Paramita actually means perfection. So equanimity is really important in Buddhist practice. And the way you cultivate equanimity is by doing mindfulness practice and brahmavihāra practice, loving kindness practice, compassion practice. mudita practice. What you're cultivating in mindfulness practice is the ability to stay balanced, whether you're experiencing pleasant sensations or unpleasant sensations. The ability to stay equally grounded with both pleasure and pain. And this is a quality that is practiced through mindfulness meditation. As you practice the ability to open to whatever you're experiencing, to be radically accepting of the inner experience of whatever is arising for you. This is the way that you cultivate equanimity. To cultivate loving kindness, no matter what your situation is also a way to cultivate equanimity. So that even if you're in pain, cultivating loving kindness meditation will help you to be equanimous with the pain. And it's possible when equanimity is well developed or is strongly present to experience pain without suffering. There's always going to be pain in our lives. If you're a sentient being, if you're a being capable of feeling sensations, there's going to be pain in your life. It just comes with the territory. But with equanimity, you can experience that pain without the mental piling on of suffering. You know, the Buddha talked about the two arrows of suffering. The first arrow is the pain. The second arrow is our mental reaction to the pain. All of the resistance that rises up. Naturally, I think it's actually instinctual and built into our DNA for that resistance to rise up, which is why it takes practice to cultivate the equanimity. The equanimity will sometimes just arise. It's a conditioned state. So whenever the conditions of that lead to equanimity are present, equanimity will arise. And when those conditions and causes change, equanimity will pass away until you achieve final enlightenment, where I believe, not on the basis of first-hand knowledge, but I believe that you experience equanimity as your regular state. So the mirror enemy of equanimity is indifference. And the mirror enemy is something that looks like the quality under discussion, but is not. So indifference may look like equanimity, but it's not equanimity. Equanimity is not an indifferent state in any way. Or as Bhikkhu Bodhi says, it's indifferent only to the demands of the ego self, with its craving for pleasure and position, not to the well-being of one's fellow human beings. So you're not indifferent to your own sensations of pleasure and pain. You're not indifferent to somebody else's pleasure or pain. It's an indifference is kind of a closed down, constricted mind space, where equanimity is very broad, very spacious. Indifference involves not caring, where equanimity involves caring deeply, but not in a way that causes suffering. So my strongest experience of equanimity was when I went to a retreat with Utejaniya, who's a Burmese monk. The retreat was in California at the Spirit Rock Meditation Center. In Utejaniya's presence, just so much equanimity arose for me. It's difficult to describe the state of equanimity, the mind state of equanimity. It's very pleasant, but with no grasping and no aversion. I was aware that at Utejaniya retreats, you don't have timed sittings. So we do a half-hour timed sitting every week at the beginning of our meditation session here. But with Utejaniya, you sit as long as you are called to sit, and then you get up and do walking meditation. So you can sit for 15 minutes or you can sit for 4 hours. Well, there's an end to the sitting period. It was generally from 9 a.m. to noon, so that would be 3 hours. And of course, you could sit over lunch too. You didn't have to go to lunch. And so the meditation hall was just silent except for the minimal sounds of rustling as people got up and quietly left the hall or re-entered the hall. And I was doing very long sits. I was doing 2 and 3 hour sits, which I don't normally do. And I was sitting in a chair because my arthritis keeps me from sitting cross-legged on a cushion the way I used to. But you become very uncomfortable just sitting still that long, no matter how you're sitting. And I was aware of the discomfort, but I was not suffering because of the discomfort. My mind was completely clear and settled and very spacious, and the unpleasantness arose, but it did not lead to aversion. And the causes of suffering are craving, aversion, and delusion. So when you're so centered that you're not pulled off into either craving or aversion or delusion, that's equanimity. And then one day, Utejaniya in a Dharma talk, well, he doesn't really do Dharma talks, but he does commentary during meditation at the very beginning of the morning from like 8:30 to 9. And then he has group sessions, 2-hour group sessions the rest of the day. And so you meet with him every other day, basically, in a group. But in part of his commentary, I thought I heard him say that your suffering is caused by your defilements, not by what the other person does, not by what actually happens. The suffering is caused by the defilements. But I heard him say your defilements, which I don't think he actually said. I think he said the defilements, or his translator did. But because I heard it as your defilements, I was kicked back into a very young feeling of it's my fault I'm being abused. It's my fault I'm suffering. And that's something that any abused child feels. Because if you feel like it's your fault, then there's at least some hope you can control it. Whereas if you acknowledge the truth which is that it's not your fault, it's the adult's fault, then there's no hope of controlling it. You have to deal with the helplessness. So it kicked me back into that very childlike place of feeling like, oh, my suffering is my own fault. And for 2 or 3 days, I had enormous suffering. Sitting even for 15 minutes was excruciating. I was in both physical and mental suffering for those couple of days, until I realized that the defilements are impersonal. They are not my the defilements are craving, aversion, and delusion. I realized that the defilements are not my defilements. They're impersonal. And that realization kicked me back into equanimity for the remainder of the retreat. It was just so vivid an illustration of the difference between suffering and equanimity, and how when we take things personally, we're cultivating suffering. I think we talked about this last week, that it's not my anger, it's not my pain, it's the anger, it's the pain. They're universal. They're not personal, they're impersonal. So I think we're coming to the end of our time for Dharma talk tonight. Are there any questions